What if the person who once swore to love you in silence ends up trying to erase you in front of millions? My name is Alejandro Cruz. At 56, I've stood on stages across the world, accepted awards for my work in cinema and documentaries, shaken hands with presidents, and been praised for telling other people's stories. But what I'm about to tell you is mine. And it begins on the very night I was honored with the Santiago International Award for Lifetime Achievement. It was supposed to be a celebration. I had just left the stage in Montevideo. Applause still rang in my ears when I opened my phone and saw a message from my wife, Camila Vélez. I can't live like this anymore. You've kept me small for too long. I've moved what's mine. Attached, screenshots of 3-wire transfers. Over $1 million had been emptied from our joint account. Her name on the receipt. Her initials under every approval. 5 minutes later, a trending live stream. Camila, crying in front of her followers, accusing me of emotional manipulation, financial control, and subtle abuse, masked as love. He controlled everything, she said. Even when he was silent, I felt watched. By midnight, I was no longer a man being celebrated. I was a name attached to a growing scandal. Brands paused campaigns. A producer canceled a pending deal. Friends stopped responding. I had become what the internet now calls another powerful man exposed. But what Camila didn't know, what most people never imagined, is that I had been watching too. Quietly, carefully. With the same discipline I brought to every film I ever made. Before I take you any deeper into this story, ask yourself something. If someone tried to take your fortune, your name, and the truth of your character, how would you respond? Would you fight back with anger? Or would you rebuild everything they thought they destroyed without saying a single word? If this resonates with you, stay with me. And if you've ever been misjudged, falsely accused, or quietly betrayed, share your story in the comments. You are not alone. And silence does not mean surrender. I wasn't always the man people now think of when they hear my name. Before the documentaries, before the awards, before the magazine covers, I was simply a boy from Valparaiso with a camera in his hand and questions in his heart. My mother was a teacher, my father a dock worker who died when I was 15. What I inherited from them wasn't money. It was silence, resilience, and a stubborn belief in building something of my own. I started my career not in front of lights, but behind the lens, chasing human stories in the shadows of forgotten neighborhoods. I became known for seeing what others ignored, violence hidden in routine, dignity hidden in poverty. It was those early years that shaped how I learned to observe before I spoke, to prepare before I trusted. That instinct never left me. And yet, even men who are cautious with the world often let their guard down in love. That's what I did with Camila. The time I met her, I was already well known. I had just finished a multi-country project on post-conflict recovery and was invited to speak at a cultural summit in Cartagena. She was there as a rising lifestyle influencer, young, charming, unapologetically magnetic. We sat on the same panel. I spoke about the ethics of media. She spoke about empowering women through digital independence. Our worlds couldn't have been more different. Maybe that's why I found her so compelling. She didn't care about my resume. She teased me for being too serious, too old school. You think too much, she'd say, laughing. Try dancing once in a while. And for a while I did. The first year was fast, vibrant, filled with public admiration. Interviews called us the intellectual and the starlet, the perfect blend of gravitas and glamour. I let her into my life slowly but fully. Access to my team, my home, my network. She had ideas and I had the means to support them. She wanted a wellness platform for women across Latin America. I helped her build it, quietly, legally, and generously. What I didn't see at the time was how subtly the balance was shifting. What began as a partnership evolved into something else. Camila stopped asking questions and started giving directives. She began rewriting our shared narrative in public, turning herself into the visionary and me into the quiet financier behind the curtain. Still, I stayed silent, not because I didn't notice, but because I told myself that love requires patience, that not every imbalance is a betrayal. I told myself she'd grow out of it. I ignored what I knew deep down. When someone begins rewriting your story while you're still living it, it's only a matter of time before you're erased entirely. It wasn't just the tone of our conversations that changed, it was the space between them. Camila became increasingly occupied with her image, with numbers on a screen that meant more to her than real moments did. Likes, shares, followers. She hired a brand team, not just assistants. She began traveling without me, claiming partnerships, retreats, filming opportunities. But when I offered to help review contracts or look into investor proposals, she smiled politely and said, "This world moves faster than yours, Alejandro. Don't worry, I've got it." That's when I realized I was no longer a collaborator. I was becoming a sponsor. She started filming parts of our life for content. Quiet breakfasts turned into stylized morning routines. Our private arguments became vague monologues on her stories about energy vampires. I watched myself fade from her narrative like an underexposed photo. And when I expressed discomfort, she flipped it. "You're trying to control how I express myself," she said once. "This is my truth, even if it makes you uncomfortable." That phrase stuck with me. Her truth. As if truth could be something tailored to suit the audience. Still, I didn't react publicly. I never posted, never commented, never even defended myself. But I did start paying closer attention. I quietly contacted an old friend in digital forensics to begin archiving her online activity. Not out of spite, but because I had seen too many lives destroyed by false narratives. I knew the power of media. I had built a career telling the truth with cameras. I also knew how easily cameras could lie. The final shift came not in an argument, but in a silence too long to ignore. I returned home early from a production meeting in Mexico City and found our house half empty. No note, no message, just missing art, cleared out closets, and the scent of her favorite perfume fading from the air. When I called, it rang once, then went to voicemail. That evening, she posted a picture of herself meditating on a cliffside in Costa Rica, captioned, "You can't heal in the same place you got sick." Thousands of likes, hundreds of comments cheering her bravery. I read them in silence, sitting in the living room she no longer lived in. That's when I knew she wasn't just leaving me. She was staging her exit like a show. And I also knew something else. This wasn't about heartbreak. It was about strategy, about timing, about a script she had written long before I saw the first act unfold. And if she was scripting her story, I had to prepare mine, not as revenge, but as defense. Because what she didn't realize was that I had been documenting everything too. 2 weeks later, while I was in Cannes for the award ceremony, the final blow came. Just minutes after stepping off stage, I received her message, the one that detonated everything in a single sentence. "I can't live in your shadow anymore. I've taken what's mine. Please don't try to reach me." 3 screenshots. Followed, bank statements showing transfers totaling over $1 million from our joint accounts to accounts under her name alone. That was money not just tied to our marriage, but to production funds, pending projects, and international partnerships. Funds that had timelines, clauses, and stakeholders. And she had ripped them out from under me with a casual swipe of her finger. I sat in the hotel lounge, tuxedo still crisp, glass of champagne untouched, while the celebration outside continued without me. But she wasn't done. Within the hour, my phone was flooded with notifications. Camila had gone live, her voice trembling. Mascara smudged just enough to appear raw, but still camera-ready. She spoke of surviving years of emotional manipulation. "I know he seems kind, intelligent, generous," she said. "That's the mask. The control was subtle, elegant even. But it was there. I forgot who I was just to keep him calm." She painted herself as the survivor of psychological imprisonment, and the audience ate it up. By morning, articles were circulating. Anonymous sources, influencers citing private conversations, think pieces on how even the most charming men could be master manipulators. I wasn't just losing money, I was losing my name. Silent calls from partners, canceled meetings, my lawyer's inbox overloaded with queries about reputational risk. Brands I'd worked with for years began distancing themselves, as a precaution. But Camila had underestimated something fundamental. She believed I lived for visibility. She thought I needed the applause, the panels, the prestige. She didn't realize that long before I ever stepped in front of a camera, I had trained to operate behind systems. I had studied trust, not just human but digital, encryption, forensics, compliance. And while she was rehearsing her victimhood in front of ring lights, I had been quietly preparing a system to protect the life I'd built. I spent that next morning not reacting, but activating. I called my lawyer, who had access to sealed evidence we'd collected over the past 6 months. I contacted a private forensic accountant who had already flagged unusual discrepancies in her financial activity. I notified the international banks managing our joint portfolios citing suspected fraud. And I opened a secure drive, one Camila never knew existed. It contained every major financial transaction, communication log, time-stamped metadata, and even private audio backups. I didn't need to post a video. I didn't need to explain myself. I just needed to do what I'd always done: gather evidence, follow the thread, and wait for the truth to speak on its own. But I wasn't angry. That's what surprised me. I wasn't shaking, broken, or humiliated. I was alert, focused, ready. She thought she had ended the story with a flourish. She didn't realize she had only turned the page, and the next chapter wasn't one she'd written. It was mine. The first move I made after that morning was entirely silent. I didn't speak to the press. I didn't respond to the growing speculation. Instead, I contacted Mateo, my longtime digital security advisor, the man who once helped a South American journalist recover deleted hard drives after a government raid. He met me in a private workspace I rented under a different name in Lisbon. There, with no cameras, no assistants, no noise, we began assembling the map, my map, of everything Camila had touched and everything she had quietly taken. Camila's public persona may have been crafted with soft lighting and filtered affirmations, but behind it was a far more calculated operator. Mateo traced her financial footprint across 12 months, multiple payments to a consulting firm registered in Panama, legal fees routed through a crypto exchange, and transfers made from our joint account to a shell company named Verde Luz Group. A little more digging revealed that Verde Luz was not just a vague holding entity. It was registered under Victor Serrano, an entrepreneur with a history of failed startups and quiet fraud settlements. Victor, as it turned out, was not just a business partner. He was Camila's ex-lover. And this new entity, this green light group, had been using my reputation, my name, and my back-end credibility to apply for wellness grants, tech incubator funds, and influencer brand partnerships. In short, they had been building a business in my shadow, and using my marriage as the scaffolding to do it. The deeper we went, the clearer the timeline became. Camila had begun preparing her exit a year earlier. She had strategically distanced herself from mutual friends, curated her empowered survivor narrative online, and even hired a crisis PR team 3 months before she ever sent that message. They were ready for the backlash. They just hadn't expected me to be even more prepared. Every wire transfer she authorized was documented, every digital signature analyzed. Her emails revealed patterns, subtle manipulations, half-truths, emotionally charged phrases designed to suggest I was too intellectual to be warm, or too logical to be safe. She had weaponized my stoicism, and the world, hungry for heroes and villains, bought her version. But now I had more than a counter-narrative. I had proof. I assembled the file into a clean report. Chronological, evidential, undeniable. I sent it not to a journalist, not to social media, but directly to my legal team, with instructions to initiate a preliminary fraud claim. I knew this would trigger bank reviews, asset freezes, and internal compliance alerts on every account tied to Verde Luz. That's when I reached out to Victor. I didn't threaten him. I invited him to lunch. He showed up, as I expected, posturing confidence in a designer blazer over a t-shirt that looked borrowed from a 2008 tech conference. I said nothing for the first 10 minutes, just watched him squirm. Then I placed the folder in front of him. Names, Numbers, timestamps, cross-reference transfers, printouts of grant applications listing my name as co-guarantor. His smirk slowly disappeared. "I'm not here to negotiate," I told him. "I'm here to offer you a single opportunity. Cooperate or disappear under the weight of your own lies." Victor leaned back, his eyes flicking to the folder, then to me. "Camila said you wouldn't fight." I smiled. Camila's always been great at storytelling, but she never understood documentation. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. By the end of that meeting, I had his quiet agreement to hand over access to the company's internal records, not because he felt guilty, but because he saw what was coming, and that was only the beginning. 3 days after the meeting with Victor, my legal team filed a formal fraud complaint with supporting documentation to the Financial Intelligence Unit. From that moment forward, it was no longer a matter of emotional betrayal or a broken marriage. It was a matter of federal interest. Camila's name appeared on multiple joint financial documents that had been altered, sometimes subtly, sometimes brazenly. In one case, she had duplicated my signature with enough confidence to submit a grant application claiming I had pledged collateral for a startup program focused on mental health for marginalized women in tech. The irony was painful. The woman dismantling me had built her credibility on empathy. Now that very persona was being cross-examined in silence by auditors, lawyers, and forensic analysts. But I stayed quiet. That was the hardest part. Every instinct in me wanted to respond publicly. My name was still circulating in headlines, though the volume had softened. Some called me a manipulative genius. Others speculated I had ghostwriters, power teams, people behind the scenes erasing my past. But I didn't respond, not because I didn't have answers, but because I knew the story wasn't done yet. I wasn't interested in winning the internet. I was interested in justice. The only public move I made was to quietly unlist myself from speaking events and appearances. Instead, I focused on assembling a narrative that wasn't built on emotion, but on traceable action. As the investigation escalated, subpoenas were issued for Camila's business operations. The digital records exposed not only misuse of funds, but falsified invoices, fabricated media kits, and influencer partnerships signed under the illusion of Alejandro Cruz's endorsement. In truth, I had never even seen half of these deals, but my name and reputation had been the currency that gave them weight. One morning, I received a call from Carla, one of the investigators on the case. "You may want to see this," she said. She sent over a private audio file, recorded during a podcast Camila had guest-starred on just weeks before the Cannes incident. It was meant to be edited out, but somehow the raw file had leaked. In it, the host casually asked about her sudden success, her clarity of voice, her timing. Camila laughed. "You just have to be ahead of the narrative. If you wait for truth to catch up, it's already too late. People believe what you feed them first." That sentence echoed in my ears longer than I care to admit. Because in a way, she was right. Timing shapes perception, but it's not the full story. The truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand quietly and wait. The next step was mediation. Our legal teams had been communicating for weeks. Camila had finally agreed to appear in person, most likely under the pressure of mounting legal costs and the quiet but growing threat of criminal prosecution. The meeting was held in a private office in Madrid. I arrived 15 minutes early. She arrived 20 minutes late. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. Still beautiful, still poised, but something about her felt strained. Her outfit was flawless as always, but her hands trembled when she poured her water. Her lawyer spoke first, reciting a prepared statement about her willingness to reach a fair settlement. My lawyer listened, nodded, then slid a folder across the table. Inside, documented evidence of every misused account, every altered document, and a typed letter from one of the foundations that had unknowingly issued Camila a loan using falsified collateral. At the bottom of the letter was the phrase, "This matter is now under review by the prosecutor's office." Camila said nothing for a long time. When she finally looked at me, her voice was low. "You were never supposed to push back." I met her gaze. I wasn't supposed to need to. And that was the moment she realized. This wasn't about rage. It was about record. The silence in the mediation room after that moment was thick, like a curtain slowly lowering on a scene neither actor wanted to admit had come to an end. Camila shifted in her chair. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but she barely acknowledged him. Her hands, usually so precise, so expressive in front of cameras, were now resting motionless on the table. I could feel that she was calculating, not in malice, but in desperation. She hadn't prepared for this version of me. The quiet, meticulous Alejandro who didn't lash out, didn't expose, didn't collapse. She had rehearsed a performance for the world, and now she stood on a stage where the only audience was the law, and it didn't care about charisma. Her lawyer attempted to steer the meeting back toward negotiation. My client is willing to relinquish her claim to the marital property in Spain and the joint business entities in exchange for full rights to the wellness brand and associated digital assets. My attorney didn't blink. Your client is not in a position to negotiate. What's being offered here is not a trade. It's a reprieve. He then placed a second file on the table, one that had been sealed until that morning. It contained communication records between Camila and Victor Serrano, including a voice memo where she explicitly instructed him to hide Alejandro's name from the legal side of the crypto transfers. It was a direct link to willful deception, what prosecutors would call intent. The terms we presented were simple. Camila would sign full ownership of the digital wellness brand over to a third-party trustee who would manage its assets until all pending investigations were resolved. She would release any claim to Alejandro Cruz's name, likeness, or endorsements. She would withdraw all public statements and issue a legal acknowledgement of false representation in 3 pending contracts. In return, I would refrain from pursuing criminal charges for financial fraud, identity misuse, and reputational damage. She didn't speak for a long time. Her lawyer read the documents, made a few notes, and asked for an hour of privacy. I walked out onto the terrace. The Madrid air was dry and cold. I watched people pass below, some talking fast on phones, others walking slowly with hands tucked into jackets. It struck me that while we sat up here parsing the ruins of a relationship, life outside moved forward untouched. An hour later, we returned to the table. Camila's lawyer cleared his throat. She'll sign. She signed without a word. Her signature, once so fluid and stylized, looked smaller now. Less confident, less certain. I didn't gloat, I didn't smile. I simply nodded as one might at the closing of a chapter that had been too long and too loud. Before she left, she paused at the door. I loved you, Alejandro, she said quietly. Even if you don't believe that now. I studied her face. There was no makeup this time, no lighting tricks, no performance. Just a woman who had gambled everything and lost. Maybe you did, I replied. But somewhere along the way, love became a transaction. She nodded, not in agreement, but in resignation. Then she walked away. Over the next few weeks, the consequences of that signature unfolded. The wellness platform quietly removed her face from all branding. A statement was issued acknowledging legal restructuring. The crypto venture was flagged for audit, and Victor, now fully cooperative, began providing names and transaction, trails that reached far beyond anything I had initially expected. Camila's influencer contracts dried up. The comments under her last video were no longer filled with affirmations. They were questions, doubts, silence. I didn't return to public life immediately. Instead, I spent time at a small cabin outside Barcelona that belonged to an old cinematographer friend. There was no Wi-Fi, no reception, just a kettle, a stack of books, and a grove of olive trees that whispered when the wind was right. I needed stillness, not because I was broken, but because I was rebuilding. Quiet is not emptiness. It's clarity waiting to be heard. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, dreams still tangled with voices from mediation rooms and live streams. But those moments became less frequent. The echo of her betrayal grew softer. And in that silence I began to remember who I was long before I was anyone to the world, before the red carpets, before the applause, before the camera ever turned on. Just a boy with a lens and a question. What is truth and what does it cost to hold on to it? Now I knew the answer, and I had paid the price. Somewhere between the silence of the hills and the quiet hum of the cafe by the sea, I realized I had crossed a threshold, not a dramatic transformation, but a slow shedding. The version of me that had once needed to be seen, understood, applauded, that man was gone. What remained was something quieter, more precise. I no longer measured my life in achievements or losses, but in moments of peace, in stillness, in the ability to look in the mirror and not flinch at what I saw. That, I learned, is what survival looks like when it's done with intention. Camila, from what I heard through mutual acquaintances, had moved abroad, Portugal perhaps, or Argentina. She had rebranded herself once again, this time as an advocate for digital self-awareness and transformational growth. No mention of her past platforms, of Verde Luz, of the controversy. Just new colors, new taglines, a different version of the same story. People were still following her, though far fewer than before. I wasn't surprised. In the age of short memory and curated timelines, reinvention is just another filter. But no matter how many times she rewrote the narrative, the truth was no longer hers to edit. Victor, on the other hand, disappeared entirely. His accounts were wiped, his company dissolved, and according to the last update from my attorney, he had moved into a government witness program. He had traded noise for safety. In that, we had something oddly in common. I didn't try to correct anyone's version of events. I didn't publish a memoir or sit down for an exposé. Instead, I finished the documentary on whistleblowers. It premiered at a modest international festival, received no standing ovation, no press buzz. But when the lights came up, a man in the back row stood silently and nodded toward me. That was enough. There's a particular kind of freedom that comes when you stop needing the world to validate your pain, when you stop proving, performing, explaining. You stop being the man they tried to bury and become the man who learned to grow in the dark. And if you're still listening, still watching, I want to leave you with something deeper than a lesson. I want to offer you a mirror. You don't need a scandal to lose yourself. Sometimes all it takes is loving the wrong person the right way for too long. And when they leave, they don't just take your time or money. They take your reflection. They twist it. And if you're not careful, you'll spend years trying to fix their version of you. Don't. Instead, become so rooted in your own clarity that no accusation, no betrayal, no manipulated story can shake you. Rebuild quietly. Heal privately. And when you're ready, step forward not to explain but to live, because the best revenge is not to make them regret what they did. It's to show them it never broke you. Some stories end with justice, others with silence. Mine ends with both. Not the kind of justice you find in headlines or courtroom drama, but the quieter kind, the one that lives in documents, in facts, in the absence of retaliation. And not the kind of silence that means defeat, but the silence of a man who has nothing left to prove. In the months following the end of the legal process, I returned to my work, not with vengeance, but with a deeper understanding of what it means to protect a life. Not just the assets or the public image, but the internal structure of dignity. I accepted smaller projects. I mentored quietly. I rebuilt my company's inner circle from the ground up, this time with even tighter boundaries. I chose my collaborators, not for their charm or ambition, but for their character. What I had lost in money and name, I gained back in clarity. And perhaps the most unexpected shift came from the audience. Not fans, not followers, but people. Men and women who had experienced betrayal and stayed quiet just like I had. They began writing, not to praise but to relate, not to ask questions but to say, I thought I was the only one. Those messages reminded me that the most powerful stories aren't the ones told with a microphone. They're the ones lived, with intention. One message stood out. It came from a former executive at a major media house. He had watched from the sidelines as my name was dragged through speculative op-eds and talk show panels. He wrote, "The most terrifying thing about your story isn't what she did. It's how easily the world believed her. You didn't fight her publicly. You let the facts work. That scared them more than rage ever could." And it was true. In a world where emotion is often louder than evidence, I chose the path of slow precision. And in doing so, I exposed not just a betrayal between two people, but a larger truth. That reputation in the wrong hands becomes a weapon. That manipulation, when dressed in the right language, can pass for empowerment. And that the ones who stay silent are often the ones holding the heaviest truths. So let me say this, especially to the men watching, those who've been told that speaking up makes you weak or that walking away without rage makes you complicit. That is a lie. Strength is not in the explosion. It's in the restraint, in knowing when to act, how to protect yourself without becoming what you're fighting. I'm not proud of having to go through what I did, but I'm proud of how I moved through it. Not perfectly, not without pain, but with discipline, with preparation, with intention. And now, as I close this chapter, not just as a man who survived betrayal, but as someone who understands the anatomy of trust, I offer you this. Don't wait until someone tries to destroy your life to start defending it. Set your boundaries early. Protect your voice. Learn the systems around you. And above all, never forget. Being quiet does not mean being weak. It means you're choosing to let your actions speak louder than your scars. And sometimes that's the only story worth telling. Months later, I stood at the edge of a quiet lake in northern Spain, the same place I used to visit in my 30s when I needed to think. The sun had just begun to dip behind the trees, casting a warm glow across the water, and for the first time in what felt like years, my mind was still. No more legal updates, no more damage control, no more second-guessing every message, every word, every silence. Just stillness and breath. I had no desire to revisit what happened with Camila. There was nothing left to dissect. She had chosen her path, and I had chosen mine. And though the public would always see only fragments of that truth, I had made peace with it. Because at some point you stop needing to correct the narrative. You realize that the people who matter already know who you are. And the ones who don't? They were never really listening. That's the real conclusion. Not dramatic, not explosive, just quiet understanding. We spend so much of our lives trying to make sense of why people betray, why they twist truth, why they walk away from something sacred, but maybe it doesn't matter why. Maybe what matters is what you choose to build in the ruins, what you choose to carry forward. For me, it wasn't about revenge. It never really was. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself I had given away too easily. Trust, silence, the benefit of the doubt. Not so I could become harder, colder, but so I could become clearer. And so, if there's anything I hope you take from my story, it's this. You don't need to destroy someone to win. You don't need to scream to be heard. You just need to know who you are even when the world forgets. Because the ones who survive with grace, with focus, with quiet strength, those are the ones who don't just walk away intact, they walk away free. In the end, what saved me wasn't power or money or access to lawyers. It was preparation, emotional, legal, digital. It was understanding the quiet architecture of trust and how quickly it collapses when built on illusion. Too many men, especially those who've spent their lives building legacies through patience and principle, find themselves unprepared for betrayal not because they are weak, but because they never expected it to come from inside the home. From someone who once whispered love into their ear and later used that same intimacy as ammunition. What I went through was not unique. That's the painful truth. I've since spoken to professionals, teachers, fathers, artists, all men who shared one thing in common. They were erased not by force but by manipulation, by narratives rewritten in real time, by a society quick to celebrate the performance of victimhood without asking for the evidence beneath the stage. But if my story has a message, it is this. Being calm does not mean being passive. Being silent does not mean being defenseless. You can move quietly, but you must move wisely. Set up systems that protect you, not just from hackers or fraud, but from emotional erasure. Learn how contracts work. Understand your digital presence. Keep a private copy of your truths. And most importantly, know when to walk away with grace rather than engage in a battle designed to strip you of your dignity. Because real strength, the kind that lasts beyond scandal and gossip, is quiet. It's the strength to sit still while others scream your name in lies. It's the discipline to let truth speak in its own time. And it's the clarity to know that survival, in its most noble form, doesn't mean escaping pain. It means refusing to let it define you. If any part of my story resonated with you, if you've ever felt cornered, misrepresented, or quietly erased, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below, not to rant, not to retaliate, but to reclaim. Let this space be one where clarity and calmness speak louder than chaos, because somewhere, someone is listening, and your silence might just be the start of their strength.